So we need to quickly talk about two concepts related to frequency. They're called relative frequency and cumulative frequency. Well, first of all, let's talk a little about what frequency itself means. Frequency just means how often does something occur. Relative is sort of like the absolute position of that frequency, that absolute position of how often some event occurs. And then if we're talking about cumulative frequency, that means that we're talking about how often that data point occurs in relation to the rest of the data in the distribution. So I'll do an example here in a moment, and you can see what that looks like. But first of all, if we are going to graphically display this idea of cumulative frequency, we're going to have to create what's called a relative cumulative frequency graph. And that's kind of a ridiculously long name. Another version of this is called an ogive. For whatever reason, those two phrases mean exactly the same thing. So we are going to go ahead and create an ogive here. And we're going to use this data. If any of you are hockey fans, you've probably heard of Wayne Gretzky. And here's some data on the number of games that he played throughout his 20-year career. If you'll notice, the number of games played has already been organized in increasing order. So in one season, not necessarily his first season, but in one of his 20 seasons, he only played 45 games. And then in another one of his, or actually two of his 20 seasons, he played 82 games each. So we've got a little bit of a disparity there between the number of games he played. You'll also notice in the column next to the number of games he played, there's a column labeled relative frequency. Now, if you notice, that's filled in with a bunch of 0.5 values. That's kind of boring. All that's telling you is that each season, each data point in this set represents 5% of the overall data, which should make sense because there are 20 data points. And so if there are 20 things, one of those things is 5% of the whole set. What we're really interested in is the third column where it says cumulative frequency. Now this might look a little bit odd, but what you'll notice is that in the first row, you start out at a cumulative frequency of 5%, and as you go down the column, in the final row, you end up at a cumulative frequency of 100%. And if your ogive has been created correctly, that last number down at the bottom should always be 100%. That means you've accounted for all of your data points. Now let's take a look and talk about how that third column of data is created. All you're doing is you're taking the sum of all of the relative frequencies up to whatever point you're at. So if you notice in the first row, we've got a relative frequency of 5%, and the cumulative frequency is also 5%. When we get down to the second row, we add another 5% to our cumulative frequency, and that gives us our cumulative frequency of 10% there. And then you just keep on going down. Go down another row, you add another 5%, that gives us 15%. And so on and so forth until you account for all 20 data points, and that gives you the 100% of data down at the bottom. But this is just the cumulative frequency table. What we actually want to create is the ogive itself. So I've already gone ahead and set up the axes for this plot. You'll notice that the number of games played is on the horizontal axis, and I guess I'd better put in some markers here. We already said that the minimum number of games played was 45, the maximum was 82. So, 45. I'll have my axis start at 40, and I'll go up to 90. That'll make it pretty simple. And so 40, 50, 60, 70, 80. Again, sorry this is sloppy, but close enough. So we've got the number of games played on the horizontal axis, and then notice on the vertical axis, it's labeled the cumulative frequency. which we saw those values in the table on the last slide. I've only labeled the 25% mark, the 50% mark, 75%, and 100%, but you could certainly add smaller intervals if you were interested in doing that. So I'll go through this and explain how we're going to set this up. So on our first line, we have 45 games played with a cumulative frequency of 5%. So that's going to be our first data point that we plot on our ogive. So if we've got 45 games and it was at 5%, that point will be about right here. Except it's not plotting. Let's see. There we go. And then our next point, we had 48 games played, and that corresponds to a cumulative frequency of 10%. So go over a little bit and up a little bit. And there's our, oops, this is not cooperating. My apologies. There we go. And let's see, next we've got 64 games played, and that's at 15%. So we skip over a bit to 64, 15%, and there we go. And I'm going to pause the video and fill in some other points so you all aren't bored to death watching me do this, and I'll be right back. Okay, so I've got our ogive created. You may have noticed I switched to X's from those dots because it's having some technical issues. But here are the points that we're able to plot from our table. Now if you count up the number of X's that you see, you might notice that there are far less than 20 X's on our ogive. And the reason for that, I'm going to go back to our table for a second, is because for some seasons, the same number of games were played several times in a row. So for instance, the first time this occurs is here when we have 2 instances of 74 games played per season. And so when that happens, notice that corresponds to the frequencies of 30 and 35%. We don't make 2 different marks for 74. We just go up to the highest value for 34, that 35%. And that's where the value for 74 is going to get plotted. So let's see if I can point out this point. It's 74 games at 34%, or 35%, excuse me. So that's going to be this point right about here. And then if you notice, the distance, the vertical distance between some of these points got very large, especially, for instance, right here in between these 2 points. And that's going to correspond to this situation down here where we had, how many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 seasons each that had 80 games played. So there's quite a big jump there. The last thing that you want to do whenever you create an ogive is to connect the points so that you can sort of see the pattern a little bit better. So that's what I'm going to do right now. You can see that the change here gets quite steep right here between about 60 games and 80 games or so per season. And it doesn't get quite as steep for those last couple of seasons. So here, again, overall is our ogive. And that's it.